is Reason Revolution. I'm your host, Justin Clark. Thank you for joining us this week. This week, I have a very special episode for you. It's not so much an interview so much as it is a conversation with a very good friend of mine. He and I have started a series of dialogue essays for his website, Christianity Now, and talking about sort of the future of secularism and religion in the modern age. And I'm really looking forward to talking with him tonight. So without further ado, here's my good friend, Tylor Lovins. How's it going, sir?
Good.
Great. So for our audience, if you'd be so kind, because my audience is primarily atheists, free thinkers, or whatever, kind of give us your background and how we came to know each other and sort of how we started this dialogue about secularism and religion.
Okay. Yeah. I come from a small town in northern Indiana, population about 2,000 people, very small high school. My graduating class had about 90-ish people.
It's not too far from mine. Mine was 120.
Okay, yeah.
I understand.
Yeah, small town.
Yep.
Yeah, I got onto religion when I was 15. There was a prominent youth group in the town, and I knew some of the people that went to it, so I attended youth group with them. I was very interested in their dialogue because it was quite a bit different from the kind of language I would hear about religion and God in the public school, among friends in the public school. It wasn't fundamentalist. And their interpretation of the Bible wasn't literalist. So I was very curious about that. I asked the youth pastor if he could recommend or give me any books on interpretation and theology. So he did. And I ended up from there going to philosophy, starting with Descartes. When I was a freshman in high school. Went to Wittgenstein, Nietzsche, Kant, some guys like those. And by the end of high school, I was pretty much done with the youth group thing. I was pretty much done with religion in general because even though the church and youth group wasn't fundamentalist, they were sort of moderate evangelicals. They still accepted what I thought was an unwarranted supernaturalism, so like a belief in the historical resurrection. So they wouldn't read Genesis as history, for instance. They would say it's a poem. But when it came to the resurrection and the Gospels, they wouldn't think about it in terms of the myths of the time.
Okay.
But they would think, for instance, that the four Gospels were historical writings instead of sort of subjective testimonies of experience using myth to sort of categorize what they encountered when they encountered the person of Jesus. So yeah, I became pretty disillusioned with that. But for whatever reason, I decided to attend a small private Christian university.
Was that out of comfort? Was it out of being familiar to you, or was it just?
Well, I had a meeting with one of the theologians that worked there when I was going around, touring colleges, and he seemed very reasonable to me. Like, I asked him point blank about the historical resurrection, and it wasn't a deflection, but it was sort of his answer reflected an inwardness and sort of an awareness that I wasn't used to. So I thought, there's probably some wisdom here that I haven't gotten. So that completely intrigued me, and the fact that when I was looking at colleges, I was looking at them from this list I'd found on top colleges to attend for philosophy. And I read the fine print finally, and the author said, actually, only follow this list if you're going to graduate school, but for a bachelor's degree, go to a small college that has its own philosophy department, so that you can get into conversations and sort of have the dialectical dialogue with professors one-on-one and really learn it and internalize it.
Yeah.
So that's what made me attend Anderson University. And as luck would have it, that philosophy professor there is the most genuine philosopher that I've met.
Right on.
The first class, I remember thinking, this is the Socratic philosophy that I was looking for. It's
fantastic.
It's not the the metaphysical stuff, the pseudoscientific systematizing of the world.
Right on.
That imposes theory onto reality, but it's like a reflection and categorization of subjective experience. And so it's about not the meaning of life, but the meaning in life. How do people sort of create meaning and relate and things like that? So yeah, I found that very fascinating, and that's pretty much what has characterized my approach to religion and secularism since, because my philosophy professor, I think he'd consider himself a philosophical theologian, so he's still within the tradition of Christianity, but he thinks about it in terms of philosophy of language, existentialism, and that's pretty much what I picked up, except I don't see myself within the tradition necessarily. For instance, I don't attend church, and I don't plan to, things like that. But I'm really interested in the function of the language, how people create meaning with the concepts, how the function of God functions in lives of believers and things like that. So yeah, that's a pretty long-winded.
No, that's fine. It's pretty concise. So one thing I noticed early on was you and I had a very much a kinship about philosophy. Now, I would say in general, my background was always more in the sort of classical liberal philosophers. So I was more in tune with Hume and Locke and Kant. And I had studied sort of the Enlightenment as a general principle. And so meeting you was nice because I think we complement each other well in the sense that you sort of pick up where I leave off. I had a very similar experience in college with a professor. I had a philosophy professor who was wonderful to me. And I ended up just taking so many philosophy classes that at some point my advisor was like, "Do you want to minor in philosophy?" And I said, "Yeah," because I thought it was really rewarding. Yeah. And so, and a good background for me, at least, is in ethics. I did a lot of coursework on ethics, and particularly the things that intrigued me were utilitarianism, and Aristotle's virtue ethics, and Kantian sort of deontological ethics. And so those were the things that I studied, as well as environmental stuff, environmental ethics. So I appreciate somebody who understands the importance of philosophy. I think one of the failures, and we'll kind of get into this a little bit later in more detail, but I think sometimes one of the failures of modern atheism or modern secularism is this sort of effete sort of disregard for philosophy. You often see it particularly in scientists, notably physicists, which I think is interesting because I think of all of the scientific fields, physics is the one that seems to me the most philosophical and metaphysical to me. But there's this excellent book that Stephen Hawking wrote called The Grand Design, which he wrote with a physicist named Leonard Milano. And it's an amazing book. I mean, it's one of the most concise and sort of really detailed and thorough, but sort of understandable text on modern physics. And they sort of start, and they literally say, I think in like the first chapter, they say philosophy is dead. And then 2 or 3 chapters later, they're like, well, basically our perspective is model-dependent realism, this and that and the other. I said, well, you're establishing a natural philosophy and then to defend the empirical evidence of your science. Like that, it's that disregard, I think. But I think part of that is for scientists, like them, or Lawrence Krauss does the same thing. I know Bill Nye has done the same thing too. Is I think when they hear philosophy, I think they don't hear sort of what they in their mind is. They're specifically talking about analytic philosophy, and that's their real problem. Is that, and this goes back into sort of the postmodern turn in philosophy, which I know you've written quite eloquently about. We'll get into, and that's really their problem. So anytime I hear some scientists say like philosophy sucks, generally my first thought in my head is like, either one, they're using a very specific term in their head when they're saying philosophy, or they're just being that obtuse. and maybe it just comes from the fact that I'm an atheist who comes from the humanities. Most of the people who I've met who are atheists, they come at it from the sciences, and I didn't. I came through it through history and philosophy and learning theology. I didn't come to science. The science stuff I learned later. But yeah, that's really a huge problem that I have. So I appreciate the fact that you have an admiration and a passion for it that I do. So let's kind of delve into how, because I've always been interested in, and maybe we can backtrack a little bit as we go along, but one thing I'm interested in is sort of like defining terms. So like, what does God mean to you? Like, what is, or is that even just like, I know we've had this discussion before, but sort of what does that mean to you as a concept, as a term?
Well, personally, I don't know if it means anything to me, actually. I sort of identify this philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein, from the early 20th century, major philosopher of language. He had said, I'm not a religious person, but I can't help but think in religious concepts or in terms of religion, and it's something that I highly respect. I sort of identify with that.
Okay.
And so I would think about the meaning of the concept of God in terms of the function it's played in the lives of others.
Okay.
For instance, this theologian from the 40s and 50s and 60s talks about the concept of God as the ground of being, so that it's that which confers ultimate meaning, or that which
and who's that? And who's that theologian?
Paul Tillich.
Okay. Right.
And he was influenced by the existentialists, so he wouldn't think of, for instance, one of the things he says is God doesn't exist, and he doesn't even mean that in terms of God exists outside of space-time, as some people would say. Yeah. He means it in the sense that God doesn't occupy space-time. God's not a scientific concept.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So philosophically, he would try to understand what sort of import does the concept of God have for a person's life that professes belief in God. And so he thinks it's one way to unify one's experiences, collect the past, and sort of direct it towards the future in a movement of hope or something. Okay. As opposed to a movement of cynicism or hatred or something. Hope and love and faith.
That's good. That's the thing I find that's interesting to me, is that there's there's a turn to me that exists, or there's sort of a fragment of it that exists within the sort of the atheist movement or secularism in general, that often tends to be very cynical, and I think oftentimes very unfortunately or unintentionally condescending, and that doesn't always work. To me, that's a sophisticated type of theology that I may not necessarily agree with, but it's one that I can identify and go, okay, that makes sense. Like that's relatable. That's something that we can touch and sort of feel. And the reason that I think you and I sort of started to talk was that I had sort of this, I don't know what you'd call it. I sort of had this sort of epiphany over a few months ago, where I was reading an excellent book by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind. And he's got a whole chapter devoted to religion. And Haidt, like me, is an atheist, but he understands, I think, the social the communal and sort of the numinous about religion that I think atheists don't always tend to get. Either because they've been a part of a religious tradition that was awful and they don't want anything to do with it, or they're like me, who never really grew up with religion and sort of never really had that was not a component to my life. So I didn't, there were certain things that other people had within a faith tradition that I didn't have, but I don't miss them.
Yeah.
It's like when somebody like wins the lottery, but you don't feel like that because you didn't buy a ticket. It's like,
there's no sense of loss.
There's no sense of loss because like I didn't participate. But Haidt talks about the idea that religion was a sort of social binding agent that was advantageous for group level evolutionary selection, which is rather controversial in some respects in the evolutionary sciences. Like I know that, for example, a very prominent atheist, Richard Dawkins, who's more of a classical Darwinian evolutionist, does not accept group selection in the way that, say, Haidt does.
Yeah.
But Haidt makes a distinction between sort of saying, okay, well, there's individual level selection, which is the primary level of selection, and then there's group selection. And particularly in social animals, it's incredibly important. And that was the first time where, like, I really had read the idea of, like, oh, like, religion is more, and I've said this a million times, I've read it in my piece, and I've said it to you, that religion is more than the sum of its beliefs. And that was really the moment that, and it's such a simple concept, but it's something I never put the two and two together, because for me, the beliefs were all that mattered, because I was interested in learning about the process. And then reading Haidt, and then eventually reading Emil Durkheim, who was a late 19th, early 20th century sociologist, who argued for sort of the social aspect of religion. So he saw religion in sort of this big term as a way, sort of similar to Tillich, in that he's sort of systematizing religion not as a reflection of the world, but as a reflection of ourselves.
Yeah.
And so he's distinguishing between whatever specific beliefs of faith tradition may have, and then sort of what the sort of ancillary effects they have on people. So like group dynamics and social grooming and things like that, like ethical conditioning, things like that. And so when I thought about it that way, I realized, like, oh, okay, this is an interesting thought, because it takes it away from being, because atheists tend to, or at least more activist types, tend to be obsessed with the beliefs. How could you believe the earth is 6,000 years old? How could you believe that Adam and Eve were the first people? How could you believe in this and believe in that? And how could you believe in the resurrection? And the problem is that, there's a certain literalism to that is not, you're kind of missing the point. And obviously, like, there are droves of religious people who are literalists like that. Yeah. And the sad part is they also tend to be in government, which also sucks. But there's a huge swath of people who are not like that. And when I met you and we had our first conversations, I realized that on some level, you are possibly the most theologically interesting person I'd ever met. Most of the religious people that I've ever talked to either gave me sort of boilerplate shit that I had heard a million times before, that I was just like, I could sort of go, okay, they're saying this. Oh, that's the teleological argument. Oh, that's the anthropic principle. Oh, that's this. And for those listening, just look it up. Just Google what I'm talking about. But with you, we were having a conversation and none of that came up. And I was like, this is really fucking weird. And then I realized as time went on that you cared just as little about that as I did. And that was the part that I thought was very refreshing. And then I realized, I was like, oh, okay. There's a different type of conversation going on here.
That's good. Yeah.
So,
one thing about the cynicism and the obsession with not even the beliefs, I don't think, but the articulation of the beliefs.
Okay.
Is there's this quote from this philosopher of religion who was a Wittgensteinian, and he says. So take this for example. I know a lot of artistic people, but if I ask them about a theory of beauty, most of them have nothing to say about it, right? They don't do art. because they have some sort of theory they're trying to apply.
Yeah.
It's sort of an expression of themselves and how they live in the world and how they connect things and what's meaningful to them. The same is true, I think, for a religious person. Most of them have never read their religious history. They haven't read the major theological works within their traditions. They can't articulate, I don't think, coherently in a secular society what it means to be a believer.
I think you're right. It reminds me of a study, a sort of a poll that was done, I think, by the Christian Science Monitor a couple years ago, where they did like a general religious literacy test, sort of like what are the basic tenets of religion, and this and that and the other. And they found out that the people who did the best on it, and again, this is also user generated, so it may have been like sort of a dogpile campaign, but the group that could identify and have the best type of religious literacy were atheists.
Yeah.
And the second were Jews, and the third were Catholics. And that's, to me, that spoke volumes, because I was just like, those are like the three most literal, like not literal, but like the three most literate groups of that.
Yeah,
but good. Evangelicals, who we sort of take as being so fervent in their beliefs, were fairly low on that spectrum.
Yeah.
And there's this huge divide between sort of the, what Daniel Dennett calls belief and belief. The idea that somehow believing is a virtue.
Yeah.
That there's something moral about it. And so it doesn't matter what the beliefs are. And it doesn't matter if you are sort of articulate about them. It just matters that you have them. And I think that's a huge distinction I think you've made that is interesting between sort of what the beliefs are themselves and what people sort of articulate or what they claim to believe.
Yeah. I think there's a huge difference there, because I think the questions sort of mess them up. The type of questions religious people get from either atheists or people outside their traditional religious community, they don't know how to make sense of it. So the sort of banner phrases that they've heard online, they'll just spit out, as this phrase right here identifies me as an evangelical Christian, and this is the move we make on the chessboard when you move your pawn there.
That's interesting, and I think you and I have talked about this before, and I can't remember the analogy that either you or I made, but it was something along the lines of like, it's like you show up to have a conversation with someone and you're speaking in English and they're speaking in Spanish. And no matter how much you're speaking, and no matter how articulate you are in your language, and no matter how correct you may be in your assumptions or whatever, they may not understand because it's a completely different language, and vice versa. And I think that sometimes, and I think through my conversations with you and reading, Durkheim especially, and William James, is this idea that like there's just a different religious language, and that I honestly am not privy to. And so it's difficult for me sometimes, because I'm reading and going like, wait, do they mean that literally or figuratively, or this is like this? Like it's very hard to grasp it when you don't have when you don't have the tools.
Yeah, that's a good point. They sort of have an insider language that some people aren't privy to. When I was reading philosophy of language, what got me into it was Wittgenstein had this idea that language is like a game. And so, for instance, you play a game of chess, and it's true that a pawn can only move one space or two spaces if it's his first move, right? It's true a bishop can only move diagonally on its own color. But is chess true?
Yeah.
Right? Well, what does that question mean? Is chess true? So if we examine this is the notion that truth is internal to a system. So if we examine religious beliefs, it would be true, I think, to say God is a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit within a Protestant or Catholic tradition. Within any Christian tradition, that's the idea of the Trinity. But is Christianity true? I think that's sort of an equivalent question to, is chess true? Well, what game are you playing at that point? You're trying to establish the rules, and the only thing that shows, I think, is that you're an outsider to the game already.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, one of the problems I think often is there's a lot of, for example, I had this long discussion with an apologist, which you and I had mentioned did not go so great. But we were talking about sort of universal truths and things like that. And he said, "Do you believe in absolute truth?" And I said, "No."
Yeah.
And he said, "Do you believe that absolutely?" And I said, "Well, logically that would imply no, I don't." And he said, "That's a contradiction." I said, "Well, no, it's not."
Yeah,
Had I said yes to the first one, it's
disingenuous.
And because he was coming to it with his own language,
right,
and I was coming to it with mine,
yeah,
and I was trying to sort of set out, like, within the logic of what I'm telling you,
that's good, yeah,
this is my position.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to one up you. I'm not trying to weasel out of this question. It became very frustrating because I realized at some level that is exactly what happened. We were speaking two different languages.
Yeah.
Because we were talking about sort of, objective truth. And I said, well, he said, well, 1 + 1 is 2. We know that. And I said, but why do we know that? 1 + 1 = 2 is a concept.
Only in base 10 mathematics, even.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you have that, but as a component, you can also talk about the fact that, words don't have meaning; they have usages. The words that come out of my mouth don't have this objective space where they get to live and hang out all the time.
That's obvious, self-evident to everyone.
They are a product of, they are placeholders for concepts. They're ways for us to be able to communicate with one another in sort of a shorthand. If it wasn't English, it would be Spanish. If it wasn't Spanish, it would be sign language. If it wasn't sign language, it would be Swahili, or it would be the Kung people who speak in clicks and stuff. But again, the concept is still there necessarily, but it's contingent upon understanding it. That goes into sort of the subjective nature of experience, and how it's often hard, in sort of the goal of science broadly, is to try to minimize that subjectivity and minimize that bias as much as possible. It doesn't always succeed because that's just the nature of reality.
Yeah.
But it was very hard to talk to somebody who had a completely different sort of framework.
Yeah.
And I understood what his framework was, or at least I attempted my best to ask a lot of questions okay, where are you coming from? But he didn't sort of reciprocate, and so it was very tough. And so he's like, this doesn't have an answer for that. I said, well, some things just don't have an answer. Are you comfortable with doubts? Or,
yeah.
That's one thing that I think sometimes upsetting for people like me, who are sort of atheists and secularists, is the idea that there are a lot of people, some of which are believers, who are just not comfortable with saying, I don't know. That it's totally comfortable and acceptable to say, I don't know, instead of making up some sort of nonsense.
Yeah. The point about language and use, that was one of Wittgenstein's fundamental insights, was the meaning of language is a function of use. So from that you get the idea of language games, but don't try to talk to someone by your understanding of the definition of words, but try to see how they infer things from the words that they use. What are they inferring by that statement? What do they think follows that statement? Or as James would say, what are the consequences? And so if we're both talking to each other and our language ends up in the same place, or by the words we say we infer the same consequences, we're probably talking about the same thing, or at least it's a distinction without a difference.
True. And that's often the struggle. That's one of the kind of the joys of talking about using sort of the Socratic Method, and which has sort of gotten a renaissance in at least the secular movement with Peter Boghossian, philosopher at Portland State, who kind of came up with this concept of street epistemology, which is basically the Socratic Method. And what he wrote a whole book about it called The Manual for Creating Atheists. Now, he doesn't love the title. That was the title the publisher gave him.
Okay, yeah.
But he's like, he said if I could have made it, it would have been, a manual for creating, critical thinkers, but that didn't sell.
Yeah.
So, and he's an atheist, so they made it work. But his whole argument is that what's really important is if you want to make somebody who has what he calls doxastically closed beliefs, people who are so cut off from the ability that they could be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal within any conversation is to be able to sort of ask questions, do follow-ups, try to understand their position as best as you can, and then try to ask questions, be like, well, why would you believe that? Why is that important to you? Things like that. And he talks about how, there are ways in which you can sort of talk with people where you can get them to sort of, if not outright reject their beliefs, because generally they won't, but to get them to reconsider them and to leave that conversation a little more open than they were when they came to it. And I had an experience like that a couple years ago where there was these two young guys who I was on campus, and it was like before class or whatever. And these couple guys were coming up to me and they said, "Hey, can we ask you a couple questions?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." So they sit down and one's holding the Bible. So I figured they're like a Bible study group, whatever. And they said, "We're doing a poll around campus about what people are." And they said, what are you? What do you identify? I said, "Well, I'm an atheist." And they said, "Well, why is that?" And I said, "Well, I kind of gave them the standard arguments about, I don't believe in the supernatural. I don't see the evidence for the existence of a God, this and that and the other." And then we sort of went on and started talking about beliefs and things like that. And then eventually it sort of turned and I started asking them questions. And I said, "Do you think that the Bible is the literal word of God, or do you think it's the inspired word of God?" And he said, "Well, I think it's the literal word of God." I said, "Okay, well, how do you reconcile, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2? The fact that there's two creation myths at the very beginning of the Bible where man is created in a different order in each one. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that there's two Adams and two Eves? Does that mean that there's is one better than the other? This and that and the other?" And he's like, "I didn't know about that." I said, "Okay, that's interesting." I said, I said, "How?" I don't know how it got to. We eventually started talking about gay marriage. And I said, "Well, why are you against gay marriage?" He said, "Well, it says in the Bible." I said, "Yes, it does say that in Leviticus. It also says in Leviticus that if your kid's sassy to you, you can stone to death. Are you cool with that?" He's like, "Oh, no, I'm not cool with that. I didn't know that." And he's like, "That's not in the Bible." I said, "Yeah, it is. You can look it up." And I said, "You might be uncomfortable with gay marriage, but the Bible is actually at least the Old Testament is fairly comfortable with slavery." And I mentioned Exodus 21. And I said, in the Bible, it's okay that you can beat the living hell out of your slave, and if they live after 2 days, you're okay. And he's like, "That's not in the Bible. I don't believe in slavery," or whatever. And I said, "Well, it's there." I said, "So do you think slavery is wrong?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I said, "Okay, why do you think it's wrong?" And he said, "Well, God says it's wrong." I said, "Well, God just said in Exodus 21 it's okay." And you could kind of just see the kind of like, "Oh fuck, I don't know," kind of moment. And I didn't mean to put him on the spot like that, but these are questions that I think are seriously worth asking, because if people are going to go around holding the Bible and saying, "I believe in this and this is the word of God and this and that and the other," and I said, "Well, you better know it." And I'm not coming at this as a guy who knows every jot and tittle of the Bible. I'm not as theologically complex as, say, maybe you are or other people are. But I read it as I read it. But these are questions that I ask. And when they left that conversation, they said, "This is a great conversation. You're the nicest atheist we've ever talked to. Usually they tell us to go away." And I said, "Well, I'm interested in the conversation. I think it's important for us to have these discussions of these beliefs. And more importantly, this dialogue here is how we create a better society. Because if we don't talk, the only other option is violence."
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the thing. I don't really know where I was going with that, other than just the fact that, I think it's interesting when we were talking earlier about the dichotomy between sort of what people claim as beliefs and then what they actually hold.
Yeah.
But so kind of on that same vein, we started this dialogue on your website, Christianity Now, where we're sort of talking about sort of the future of religion and secularism in the modern period. I thought your essay was particularly insightful. I agreed with about almost all of it. I think the big thing that you're talking about is could you share with the listeners sort of one of the worries that you have about sort of the postmodern turn in modern life, and particularly its connection to nihilism and its sort of rejection of what I would call sort of anti-life or anti-human concepts?
Yeah. The sort of ironic thing is I would have considered myself postmodern up until probably the end of last year.
Right on.
And I had used some of the arguments that I now think are very problematic. And I think I can understand how people get there, because postmodernism sort of arose as an anti-enlightenment philosophical movement in the 60s. And it started with this problem of interpretation. So I can interpret a text any way I want, because there's this distinction between, for instance, the signifier and signified, but it's basically, you can put it in easier terms, a word and what it represents. What guarantees that the word will represent what you want it to represent when you put it down on paper and I read it? There's nothing there but social conventions, really. And actually, 400 years later, there's nothing there at all except the language I've inherited, the amount I know about history from that time period. But it's all words. So there's this framing issue, and the postmodernists say they could use Wittgenstein here, but all language is a function of social relations. The meaning of all language is a function of that. So the postmodernist move is to say social relations are established by power, so that any claims, whether it be claims for rationality and truth, political claims, religious claims, they're all power moves. And who determines the meaning of that? It's whoever has the most influence, whoever has the most power. So that we can change history, we can change language, we can change whatever we want to change if we just will it and sort of get together and collaborate.
Yeah, that's what the sort of one of the postmodern philosophers, Jürgen Habermas, called communicative action.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't realize it, but I didn't realize how much of postmodernism I actually got in college until I left college and started reading about critiques of it online. And I was like, oh, I've read all of this. So so just to give you a little bit more context, so the main school of the postmodernists do come out of France.
Yeah.
It's Foucault,
Derrida.
Derrida. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it also does, in some respects, start possibly about a half a generation before with the Frankfurt School. Mm. With Walter Benjamin and his name escapes me at the moment, but another philosopher I read, the idea of sort of mass communication as a means by which we sort of communicate sort of the capitalist sort of hierarchy. He has this concept, and it's killing me that his name's like not there. But anyway, the Frankfurt School were incredibly important, and then eventually would become the French school. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important, and you make a great point of this in your piece, but that this is inherently tied to Marxism. So could you go into sort of how postmodernism, after the horrors, the beginning of the horrors of sort of communism, started to sort of unearth themselves in the post-war world, and people learned about what had been going on in the Soviet Union and Stalinism. There was this sort of academic shift with Marxism, where it was a shift away from sort of relationships in terms of classes, but rather a relationship of power.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Orwell, I think Orwell was one of the people to get this ball rolling in his book, Road to Wagon Pier.
Yeah.
He says socialists shouldn't use distinctions of class to further the cause, but we should categorize ourselves in terms of oppressor and oppressed, and we should rally around that distinction.
Yeah. And that goes even further in a later essay that he wrote near the end of his life. I think he wrote it either right after or right before he completed 1984, but a great essay called Politics in the English Language, which is another sort of seminal essay where he sort of talks about that. And that's all, in many ways, I mean, I think the most important contribution that Orwell made, because 1984 is a great book, but the problem in 1984 is it assumes that a totalitarian state would be run perfectly and efficiently.
Yeah.
And it never is. One of my favorite movies ever is Terry Gilliam's Brazil, which is sort of the anti-1984. I mean, the movie starts with somebody being killed because of a paperwork error.
Okay.
They got his name wrong in like the paperwork, so they come and kill him, and then they realize, oh wait, we got the paperwork wrong. And so,
That's good.
Bureaucracies are inherently inefficient. They tend to be, and they tend to be often not terribly efficient or rational. But Orwell makes this point in Politics of the English Language that basically that he who controls the narrative controls the world. And it's something he makes in 1984 as well. And it's the idea,
That's a postmodern move,
yeah,
too.
That's a very postmodern move.
You talk about narratives.
Which is very interesting because I think if Orwell was alive today, he would be one of the most staunch opponents of postmodernism.
Yeah.
But I think what he was saying was not so much a endorsement so much as it was a warning. And because, as Chris Richens made a great point in his excellent book on Orwell, he said, Orwell got the three major horrible phases of totalitarianism right in the 20th century. He understood them, fascism, communism, and Stalinism. He understood it. Or not Stalinism, but fascism, communism, imperialism. He understood them, and in a way that many people could not had anticipated. So it's interesting that Orwell was both sort of the physician who sort of rendered a diagnosis, but at the same time didn't really offer a prescription.
Yeah.
He just sort of left it as that. Maybe that's the fact that he died in 1949, and
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree with your central premise about your piece, about the idea that there's this postmodern term, and as sort of the unifying forces of religion wane in the modern context, something sort of else replaces it.
Yeah.
Which is something, it's interesting. I'm so glad that, because your essay was wonderful, but it also echoed a fantastic essay that was either in Newsweek or Salon by Peter Beinart, who wrote a very similar thing to you, where he said, as religion goes away, there's sort of a salve that comes in to sort of cover the wound. It doesn't really heal it, but it sort of covers the wound, and that is identity politics. And so he talks about the idea of, as religious affiliations go away, political affiliations become more intense, and I think that's a diagnosis that I think you made astutely in your piece.
Thanks.
So talk about the problem of identity politics, because we've heard a lot of this in the sort of modern zeitgeist lately, particularly with public intellectuals like Sam Harris and especially Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
So
Shermer
now,
Yep.
Pinker, Steven
Yep.
Pinker, who's one of my heroes, has talked about it. That the problem with identity politics is that it's necessarily connected to sort of that postmodernism.
Yeah.
So kind of, if you'd be so kind to kind of go into that.
I think one of the problems is completely external. There's no robust conception of the individual in identity politics.
I agree.
In that conception, everyone's either an oppressor or a victim. What sort of confers worth onto my individuality is the extent to which I sacrifice for the oppressed. So I read this. I've been reading Ayn Rand recently. To my horror.
I actually was bringing up a quote of hers, which I think is relevant to this discussion.
So, yeah, everything I've heard from her has given me sort of a visceral reaction every time I've heard her name.
Mm-hmm.
But she's very prescient, I think, on these issues because
yes, I agree.
Because there's no robust conception of the individual. When we're alone, we have no moral value. It's only when, for instance, when I give the appearance of being in solidarity with someone who's oppressed, that seems to be the minimum amount of individuality that's given to someone nowadays. So I'm only valuable as an individual to the extent that someone perceives me as acting on behalf of a victim of some kind.
I think that's true. And that's, I think, really the dangerous turn of it, because one of the problems that exists when a society sort of loses its concept of individualism is that there becomes this sort of rampant sort of rotting collectivism that eventually sort of permeates the culture, where we go away from the sort of classical concept of, equality before the law to just equality, period. And it's we then go from equality of opportunity, which was generally the classical American notion, or the classical liberal notion, to equality of outcome.
Yeah.
And this is there's it's really pervasive. It reminds me of a great quote by the economist F.A. Hayek, where he says, there's all the difference in the world between granting people equality and attempting to make them equal.
Yeah.
And that's really the problem, is that there's this, I think, notion, and this goes back to the postmodern notion of power, that if you belong to a certain group, you were then given a sort of a more, I don't know how you would call it, sort of a moral, like a moral bank account, right?
Yeah.
So if you're of a particular minority, or if you're of a particular, segmented group, that automatically confers upon you some level of moral worth that you would not get otherwise. And the problem with having a conversation about this is even broaching these subjects often leaves people with the impression that you don't care about those other people, that somehow,
right,
or at the very worst, they'll call you a racist or a sexist or something like that, when in reality what you're trying to do is get to the heart of the thing. But
it regresses on what a problem I think religion solved back in the 12th or 13th century. The Greeks had, even though they did have something like free society, they also had a deeply embedded belief in inequality, natural inequality. So, for instance, they were okay with slaves, the subjugation of women, but also they had the family was sort of their religious and political center for the individuals. So women were only people to the extent that they were identified with their family. There was a central role, for instance, of the hearth, where it represented not only dead ancestors, but the possibility of immortality, in the sense that each family in their ancestral worship could protect sort of their identity in the afterlife by keeping up with the fire that they had burning in the hearth. But anyway, the Stoics had this notion of logos, which was this cosmic reason or natural order of things, and that sort of conferred equality in nature somewhat. but it still didn't solve the problem of inequality between persons. And religion, in taking the Logos and calling it the Son of God, gave a sort of equality of moral status to everyone. You no longer had to be just part of the family to be considered moral, but you were moral because you were, or at least my encountering of a stranger, I was no longer just hostile of you, but there was the possibility of receiving a gift from you in terms of truth, goodness, beauty. But yeah, one of the things identity politics does is, in its reduction of the individual, it takes away the possibility of moral equality, or the morality residing in the individual.
I agree. To echo that, I mean, in many ways, the classical liberal tradition that sort of emerged within the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries sort of echoes that notion of the Logos with the concept of natural rights. And natural rights became, the natural rights tradition became one of the cornerstones of settling on some level. Not so you had sort of the Logos, and that was sort of like the religious form of moral equality, but then you had natural rights, which was sort of the political or secular version, the social of it. And it confers upon an individual a responsibility. Rights imply responsibilities, and this is interestingly enough, I was talking with you earlier about my love for Rockefeller Center. If you go to Rockefeller Center, there's this beautiful plaque, this marble stone. It literally looks like a 10 Commandments, and it is 10. And they are kind of commandments, but they're from John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was the guy who sort of put the money forward on it or whatever. And his quote is something along the main quote he takes away of it is this, like, the first thing he has on it, on the top of it, it says, "I believe in the supreme worth of the individual and his or her right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness." So he's echoing Jefferson, who's echoing Locke and echoing the classical liberal tradition. He then says, like, every right implies a responsibility. Every responsibility implies a consequence. So he's talking about this idea that rights and freedom and individualism have in and of themselves a certain level of risk, but the risk is beneficial in that, because you were talking about, like, life is suffering, right? How I would echo that would be that poverty and pestilence is the natural condition of man. That through individual rights, property rights, political equality, social equality, then you can have a society that can flourish. The problem, in my opinion, with identity politics is that it takes away the concept of rights and replaces it with privileges. So there's a lot of discussion about white privilege and things like that. The problem with basically either saying everything is a right or conferring everything about privilege is that then there's no clear distinctions about what rights are. And when there are no clear distinctions of what rights are, they're more easily abused. So, individualism, to me, particularly moral individualism, I think is the hallmark of sort of enlightened Western liberalism. And I think the issue we see today with sort of the rise of the alt-right and the regressive left is this rejection of reason, this rejection of individual rights, and this rejection of political equality. The quote from Ayn Rand that I think is really present to this conversation is, she says, "The smallest minority on earth is the individual. Those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be defenders of minorities." And so, it's not saying that we shouldn't fight for certain levels of equality. It's not saying that we shouldn't fight for, the civil rights movement or women's rights or whatever. But what it is saying is that rights are not the same thing as privileges. And that's and the problem is that there's a lot within our political discourse these days, particularly on the left, that conflate rights and privileges.
Not to change the topic, but I think religion and its concept of faith has a pretty robust understanding of the individual. Um, I know I've said this before to you, but I think the tradition of existentialism is a secular interpretation of religious language.
Yes.
And in existentialism, they have this concept of inauthentic or authentic existence, or that's from Heidegger, and then Sartre would say good or bad faith. But it's this idea that I can either make my next move by doing what I think everyone wants me to do, or within a radical decision where no choices in front of me seem inherently valuable, make my own path and make my own value by what I choose. So, for instance, when you talk to people who are religious, they think theologically in one of two ways. This notion of theology from above or theology from below. So theology from above tries to take the God view of things and tell you what God wants, what God hates, and they live their whole life, for instance, under this understanding of themselves as being subjugated to a higher power.
Okay.
Or you'll find people who think about theology from below, so they take existence as primary, and they think about life in terms of their experiences first, and not in terms of abstract conceptions of reality, i.e., the God. They'll think about God in terms of their experiences, and they won't think about their experiences in terms of God. So that's a sort of distinction between conservative and liberals, I think.
Could you unpack that a little bit? Because I think that's interesting.
Yeah. Those who do theology from above typically equivocate faith and belief. So being a person of faith or having faith in God would mean intellectually assenting to a set of doctrines. So maybe infallibility of Scripture, the virgin birth, the historical resurrection, the existence of God, things like that. So what it means to have faith for them is just accepting those doctrines no matter what the evidence says or no matter what you hear in the world. For people who do theology from below, faith is a disposition towards reality or towards the world as a whole. So faith means to them, for instance, having hope, even if there is no optimism, having hope in any situation, having hope for a better future, openness towards others. Salvation, for instance, would mean something like freedom from the past, and freedom for liberation, freedom for freedom's sake, which is an open relationship with other people where alienation isn't the terms or grounds on which we meet each other, but sort of a hospitality. There's completely different ways of living.
That's really interesting, because one of the most recent books that I finished reading, and it was extremely good, but very dense, is a book called The Philosophy of Secular Humanism. It's a book by a philosopher named Orwells Diagnosis, who was I guess he was sort of a acolyte of John Dewey.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the secular humanists are. So
Yeah.
him, Sidney Hook is another one.
Okay.
And they all love Dewey.
Yeah.
And because Dewey gets to the heart of a lot of what you're saying, but doesn't do it with the sort of the supernaturalism or the sort of Platonic thinking that William James does. He kind of still gets to the heart. But what Lamont argues for in the philosophy of secular humanism is very much similar to that sort of what you're talking about, the sort of faith from below.
Yeah.
So it's a faith in... It's sort of a faith, and when I say faith in this context, I'm not specifically meaning religious faith. What I mean, I guess, in some respects, is faith is sort of hope
Fidelity
fidelity to principles,
Yeah,
expectation of something based on prior knowledge, things like that. So he talks about the idea of openness and tolerance and a dedication to reason and science. But he also makes a great point of the fact that humans are not perfectly rational. They're not perfectly empirical.
Yep.
That there's a part of us that's very irrational and messy. And that the goal is to acknowledge on some level what that might be and sort of either embrace that part of you in sort of the emotional sense, sort of, which kind of goes back to Hume, the idea of reason is the slave of the passions, which I think Hume is right. That, Haidt describes it as sort of the passions or intuitions or sort of the moral instincts of us are sort of the elephant, and the reason within us, is the rider, and the rider is constantly having to control the elephant. And so that's the thing. I think the problem with some atheists, and I think libertarians make this mistake too, is they assume that humans are perfectly rational. And I don't. I know that because I'm not. And, my wife gets on my case all the time. She's always like, you're too emotional. You didn't think that through. That was dumb. And I'd be like, yeah, you're right. That was dumb. Had I taken 2 more seconds or 2 minutes, I would have come up with a more reasonable conclusion. So I guess my point was basically just like Lamont is making that same argument of sort of an affirmative philosophy of life. So it is sort of a faith from below, and that he has a hope and a confidence and a certain level of sort of trust, as you mentioned, sort of fidelity to principles that a religious believer would have. But he argues with them within the context of sort of a secular, humanistic framework. And that's something I'm really interested in, and something we'll get as we do more of our pieces for your site, is talking about, okay, because I think your essay was a pretty good, in some respects, damning critique of the sort of the problems of secularism. So the argument here is like, okay, if religion is waning, what is the alternative?
Right.
And so my argument is that the alternative is secular humanism. It's the argument that secular humanism in and of itself is sort of a religion, in that it has certain core principles, and you have a certain, like as you mentioned, fidelity to principles, which is a phrase I quite like. I'll credit you if I ever say it again. But a fidelity to principles and a certain level of openness, but without sort of the baggage of supernaturalism. And so, we see this now. Phil Zuckerman, who's a secular scholar out in the West Coast, has written a whole book about this, called Living the Secular Life. And I know that Bart Campolo, who's an amazing guy, who's a humanist chaplain out in California, whose dad is Tony Campolo, the very well-known Christian author. Bart Campolo is basically, he's like a youth pastor, but for secular people. And he's doing these amazing things where people are coming together and they're sharing each other's experiences, and they're having that sense of community and that sense of oneness with other people, but without the baggage of religion. And I think, hopefully, I don't think it's going to be the full alternative, but I do think that that's something that is good. That's fundamentally good, because in my opinion, humans are fundamentally relational. We care about what others think about us. We care about our own moral selves in relations to other people. Like, that was the problem I had with that apologist I talked to a while back. I said to him, you look at morality as being completely cut off from human beings and their relation to one another. And I'm saying that morality or ethics is relational. It's about how we live with one another. If I'm alone on an island, I don't have to be moral because I'm by myself. Morality is necessarily more than one person. And I think that what secular humanism should offer, because I do think that being non-religious should offer something, because, we spend so much time talking about what we don't believe. We don't spend enough time talking about what does matter to us, what we do believe. And that humanism, non-belief needs to become more affirmative. Which I know sounds kind of like a contradiction in terms, because the term itself is not affirmative, but humanism is, and that's at least my thinking on it. I mean, I don't know if you've come to a conclusion on this yet. I don't think I have, but what do you think happens with the future? What do you think happens with religion and secularism, particularly in the U.S., where the largest growing religious denomination in the country is none?
Yeah.
Which is NONES, not nuns like in the habit, but nuns.
I think we'll have to reckon with the functional difference between rational thinking and religious thinking, where I sort of draw this out very briefly in that article, but I think science and rationalism deals in the realm of objectivity or truth,
Mm-hmm.
and religion deals with meaning or the problem of suffering. So I'm not sure, even though I think, for instance, psychologists and therapists are the closest things secularism has to pastors.
I totally agree.
Functionally, for instance, I see a therapist, and it's very helpful in overcoming suffering, unifying my identity, giving me techniques to overcome anxiety.
Yeah.
I think religion does the same thing, but I don't know that science does anything like that.
I don't think it does. And this is a discussion that I get into all the time with people, particularly on my side of it, because I mean, I love science. Science is I think one.
And psychologists are scientists.
Yeah,
right? But they're not doing science when they're doing therapy.
I think Bill Nye may have said this, and I agree with him, that science is the greatest thing humans have ever come up with, and I do believe that. And what I think is important is that distinction that you make in your piece between sort of scientific thinking and religious thinking. I totally agree with it. I guess I would word it differently, just based on my secular position or my secular viewpoint, where I would say it's the scientific point and the ethical point, because you're getting to the heart of a classical problem in philosophy, which is the is-ought problem.
Yeah.
From Hume, where you can't derive an ought from an is. And I may have said this to you before, but my argument is that you can't derive an ought from an is, but ises inform oughts. So what I mean by that is so for example, think about it with food, right? Food is the way that we nurture our bodies and continue to live. Battery acid is not food. Objectively, we know that if we were to drink battery acid, it would kill us. So yes, it's not a direct connection between battery acid is bad, you shouldn't drink it, but knowing that a battery acid is a problem confers upon you the ability to make a choice, right?
Yeah.
But you still have to make a choice, right? And so that comes with the bearing of what is the good? What do I want? You know what I mean? And this gets to the heart of the heart of what, Dewey and others have argued. And Philip Kitcher made a point of in his book on secular humanism that when you make a claim about the world, it is ultimately an ethical position. Because when you're arguing for, say, something being true, what you're really arguing for is that it's true because it's in accordance with what is good for us. You know what I mean? So the bigger point I guess I'm trying to make is that what we learn about the world helps us to then discern what we do. It doesn't give us complete answers by all means, because I do think that ethics and philosophy and in your case theology have a component to this. But I do think that there are some basic things you need to know about the world in order to, I guess, make moral decisions. I guess at the end of the day, it's don't walk out in the middle of the street, because you kind of know what's going to happen, unless you want to die, and then in which case that's a whole other question. But but the point is that you can learn about the world and then use your knowledge to then inform your decision making. But you can't automatically just make a decision. What you learn about the world will not give you a choice. It only gives you the possibility to understand it and then create a choice for yourself.
I think that position, though, sort of contradicts what you held earlier in terms of humans also being intuitive and not just rational. Because
it's true.
There's a book, Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yeah,
book on
Daniel
economics.
Kahneman, yeah.
Yeah, but he talks about the two systems that operate our thinking. And he says, abstract thinking is sort of an anomaly in our day-to-day. We actually make decisions before we think about them. So that the is-ought problem to me is really, for instance, it would be like saying the problems of chess are the problems of every game invented. It's seeing and it's imposing an abstraction onto every possible way of relating. Because for instance, I do think people equivocate the is and the ought when they have some sort of moral grounding. When you don't have an is and an ought, when you have the is-ought distinction, that's when you're at a crisis point, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. So let me kind of re-clarify what I was saying. So when I've had these discussions with people, I tend to generally break down moral agents into sort of there's two sections to them. I call it the moral instinct and the moral framework. When I was talking about earlier with the is informing oughts, that's the moral framework. That's sort of the intellectual, the analytical, the abstract nature of human beings. But there's also the moral instinct, which is it's hardwired into us. It's a product of our evolution. Dan Barker tells this great story about being in an airport and watching a woman place her child on top of like a bag, on top of like a suitcase. And she like turns real quick and the baby starts to fall. And he automatically grabs it by the leg and like saves it from hitting the floor. And now Dan Barker says, well, I've never met those people. I'll never see them again in my life. Why the hell did I do that? He said, because I'm hardwired to do that. Because I would do that with my own kin. And in my brain, the instinctual part of my brain doesn't make a distinction. It just does. And there are a lot of intuitions. That's Haidt's point too. And I find it, and I think this is my bias fucking with me, because I have such a hard time like just letting go of it. But he makes the same point. He's like, I'm a moral intuitionist. I think most people, they make a moral decision and then they rationalize it later. And I think in some respects, these sort of ises inform oughts can work that way, in the sense that like you can make a moral choice and then go, now, why the fuck did I do that? And then you kind of sit through and kind of walk through it and you rationalize it later. There's a difference between reasoning out a choice and rationalizing one. And I think that's a distinction to make. And I'm glad that you caught it, because I think you're right. We often think we're such masters of our domain, and we're not. Like so much of us is not. You know, it's kind of like the iceberg, where you see the iceberg up top and then there's the huge part of it below. And I like to think of it that way, that the rational part of us really is like the tip. And the intuitional and emotional part of it's like really the big shit in the underwater that we don't see or we don't want to acknowledge. And I think the goal of being a reasonable person is not to be like this like perfectly rational, like Spock-like character. Or what people misinterpret as Spock. But actually be like Spock, because we're going to get a little Star Trek nerdiness, gotta love Star Trek. So the reason why Spock is a great character is because Spock is humanity. He is humanity to a T, because his father is a Vulcan and his mother is a human. And so he's constantly riding that line between logic and feelings, reason and reactions. And he's trying so damned hard to suppress this other part of him. But as the series goes on, especially as the movies go on, he learns to embrace the human part of him. And which is why Kirk is a great foil to him, because Kirk is the complete opposite. Kirk is the intuitive one, he's the impulsive one, he's the emotional one, he's the passionate one. And this is the genius of Star Trek, Kirk is also very rational too. It's just one takes primacy over the other. So that's kind of the beauty of the show, is that the beauty of those characters is that what people think is Spock isn't really Spock. And so, you know, the goal is to try to embrace the fact there's a big part of you that's intuitive, but then at the same time, like, acknowledge that, and then remember that sometimes those institutions aren't great, and you should probably think about some things too.
So when I went to the meeting on Sunday morning from 10 to 2.
Oh, Coffee and Conversation at CFI. Please donate to CFI. They want to keep their building. CFIindy.org. Please give them money. Anyway, go ahead.
I went there because I was curious about what would happen, you know, how it's structured. But also it was interesting that it took place around the same time church traditionally does.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, is this the one of the secular attempts to replace church?
I think so. Yeah.
So here's the interesting thing. You know that distinction between the rational and intuition, like we were just talking about. When I went there, it's it's sort of this forum where there's a few tables, there's a bunch of people. You can sit at whatever table you want, talk to whoever you want about whatever you want.
Yeah.
And there's donuts and coffee.
Yep.
So it's a time to be relational, to meet new people, talk about things you otherwise wouldn't. But the whole time it seemed like we were problem solving. And so it was a completely rational endeavor.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
And the interesting thing about, for instance, I understand the concept of sin to mean we're alienated from each other and alienated from ourselves because sometimes I do what I don't, when I'm reasoning, I don't want to do. And I think is bad and I shouldn't do. But I do it anyway. Right? Paul talks about this, but so I have a sinful nature. That's sort of, I think, what that means. There's what it means to be human. Part of it is to be alienated all the time from myself and others, and the only way to achieve salvation from that is to forgive, to love, to hope, to have faith in the future, to have faith that people sort of can overcome their sinfulness, things like that.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing to me about attending the CFI event was when I went to churches, they would have this time of worship, this time of prayer, this time of sermon, and through all these functions, one is reminded of the sinful nature and the possibility of salvation. But there was nothing like that at the CFI.
No. One of the things that is interesting is, I was there the same day you were, but we didn't really get to chat because, there were literally almost 2 or 3 weeks where I went to that and I literally spent the whole fucking time talking about Trump.
Yeah, yeah.
And we almost got an hour and a half that having to bring up Trump, and it was wonderful. But it's very political because these people are like me, very political.
Yeah,
and generally my show is political. Because I think I am totally what you've talked about in your piece, in the sense that now that I'm not religious, I don't have God.
Yeah.
I've sort of replaced that with a civic religion, and that is politics. And I will admit to that. Yeah. Politics to me is a way of being able to because I'm obsessed with ethics. I'm obsessed with the normative nature of humanity. How do we make our lot better? And how do we make life better for ourselves and for others? That's the thing I'm most interested in. And politics is one way of doing that. The problem is that sometimes the conversations only focus on that one part. And I think sometimes it misses some of the deeper, I think, more rewarding conversations like the ones you and I have that are a little less political necessarily and more interested in sort of the more abstract concepts. I could see you coming to that and being very disappointed. And part of it's just the nature of the beast, right? So some of these people are just regular Joes.
Right.
They're just regular folks. Or they're very highly educated people who, like most of us, especially may have a fucking axe to grind. And I totally get that. But sometimes it's not very rewarding because you're kind of going over the same things over and over again. It's okay, how many times can I talk about tax reform? How many times can I talk about infrastructure projects or net neutrality? It's this is interesting stuff, but sometimes it's interesting to me. I go to a place that's explicitly non-religious, and I'm kind of interested in talking about religion. I'm kind of interested in talking about religion and ethics and humanism and things like that. And yet some of these people are just they don't have that kind of interest, and it can be alienating.
It's interesting that you say you replace religion with civic religion.
Yeah.
Because when you were talking about ethics earlier, you were talking about how it's fundamentally relational, how it involves other people.
Yeah.
Now that I've started reading Ayn Rand,
Yeah.
she has a conception of morality I've never seen
Yes.
articulated in the secular world.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I think it's very close to the religious insight, because she says morality doesn't require the sacrifice of myself nor the sacrifice of others.
Yes.
And even though I haven't read her enough yet, but I'm definitely going to spend some time on her works.
No, you get the concept.
She has a very good conception of morality when I'm alone. Right? You said there's no morality on an island.
Yeah.
But Ayn Rand would disagree.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the classic adage of no man is an island, she would say every man is an island.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is the fundamental thing about what I think is interesting about Ayn Rand, because what's interesting is, you may not have read as much of her work, but you get it better than I think the majority of people, because they miss this insight. So Ayn Rand really does overthrow, in many ways, centuries of sort of established wisdom about how we live with each other.
Yeah.
So she is an ethical egoist, not an egotist, but an egoist. Right. And egoism is the fundamental principle that your life, and it comes with it also comes with the classical notion of self-proprietorship, that you own your life, that your life belongs to you, that no one owns you.
Faith in God.
Yeah,
that's what it is.
Yeah, it's and in that religious notion, exactly.
Functionally, yeah.
And you can tell that in many ways, her philosophy, and it's indirect, but it's there, is she's heavily influenced by Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle.
That's right.
And so, because the philosopher that she identified with the most and always repeatedly went back to was Aristotle. But I think in some respects, sometimes with Aristotle, it's a package deal. You get him and you get Aquinas. And so Rand's concept, and this is the quote from Atlas Shrugged, which you kind of paraphrase, which is, "I swear by my life and my love of it that I will not live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for the sake of mine." Now, for most people in the world, that's about the most horrific thing they've ever heard.
Right.
But she's not saying...
Yeah.
What she's not saying this in a Gordon Gekko, greed is good, fuck everybody kind of sense. Yeah. She's saying it in the sense that human beings have a right to their own life, and she talks about the idea of human beings are an end in and of themselves.
Yeah, that's right.
And that you should live your life as you see fit, so long as you don't violate the rights of others. And that's a key component that she doesn't explicitly say, but it's an important component. So
and she doesn't, for instance, she would say, live your life how you would want, but she wouldn't say that is good, that is the good. That doesn't necessarily mean you're living a good life.
No.
Right? Because she says the good life is achieved in the attainment of rational pursuits.
Yes.
Which would always take into consideration others and my not sacrificing them.
Exactly.
Right?
And the thing that's the beauty of her work, and why she was heavily influential on me, is this idea that she describes that I believe in man as a heroic being.
Yeah.
Who lives as an end in of itself. I'd never heard that in my life. That, generally the way that people talk about humanity is that we're a cancer upon the earth. Right. We're the scourge of the earth. We're horrible, we're awful, this and that and the other. And here's Ayn Rand coming in saying, no, humanity is fundamentally good. But what she means by that is, she has this great simple quote. She says, I believe in man, not men.
Yeah.
And so it's that distinction where she talks about that idea of the individual versus the mass. And that is the fundamental concept behind The Fountainhead. The Fountainhead is her book on man's relationship to man, or man's relationship to himself. Because Howard Rourke, the character who's of the central character of The Fountainhead, is an architect, and his whole thing is that he will not make buildings with compromises. If they want to put something else on it, they want to play around with it, that's fine. but I will not let you build my building, and I will not work with you. He doesn't hurt them. He doesn't steal from them. He doesn't do any of that. He just says, if you will not accept my building as is, I will not build it. And one of the actions he takes towards the end of the book, and I hope you don't mind me spoiling it, because this is, I think, a key component, and I think he's commissioned to build this series of like low-income homes. Well, his name is sort of like persona non grata, so he has to go through somebody else. And the book was originally supposed to be called Secondhand Lives. That was the original name of the title of the book. And Ayn Rand talks constantly about the second-hander, the moocher, the person who lives off of the energies and the achievements of others. And in the book, that character is manifested in a guy named Peter Keating. So Rourke wants these built because he's developed a way for them to be made cheaply and efficiently and to be good for people. But he wants them built as is, and he knows they won't take that because it's a government project. So he says, Keating, I'll give them to you. I don't want my name on or whatever, but you build them as they are. Keating says, fine. Keating doesn't do what he asks. Keating lets them fuck around with it, change things, and that pisses him off because you fundamentally violated his sense of morality, his sense of individualism. So what does Howard Rourke do? He blows it up. In an act of defiance, he destroys this housing complex, and then goes on a trial. And he gives this long speech talking about the fact that a man's vision should be as is, and that when you violate the sort of individualism of someone, you violate the rights of everyone. And then you create a situation in which she refers to later in the books that you read of moral cannibalism. The main takeaway of this is that Ayn Rand did not believe in sort of people fucking each other over and this and that and the other. Like, no, she believed in sort of people being rational actors serving their self-interest, and in doing so they build a better society. Not because they wanted to build a better society, but because they wanted to do what they wanted to do.
And within that they fundamentally valued life. Yes,
it's an affirmation of life, which is something that I also appreciate of philosophy, because most philosophies are a philosophy of death. They are obsessed with how horrible human beings are. They're obsessed with how dark and horrible we are, and it's not affirmative. And so her philosophy is one of the few secular philosophies, in my opinion, that is an alternative. In the sense that you could really build a good society based on that. Because people just assume, everybody's a sociopath. It's not. The people who say these things about Ayn Rand have either never read her, or they've read shitty salon.com pieces about her. Like, they don't really get it.
Right.
Anyway, that's kind of my long piece on that. I just think it's important because Ayn Rand was foundational to my atheism and foundational to my love of philosophy. Through her, I read everything else. And she's a wonderful introduction to philosophy because she's extremely readable and quotable.
Yeah, she is. I think... her ethics is a natural extension of the conception of the self found in existentialism.
Yes.
And that's what I've really loved about it.
Absolutely.
So far. And I've only read maybe, 130 pages.
Yeah, and you get it. One of the beautiful things is if you're interested in reading sort of an overview of her work, a great book to get is a book called For the New Intellectual, which is
that's on my list.
Which is a collection of essays. It's basically a collection of parts of her book that summarize her philosophy, and it comes with like a 50-page introduction essay where she outlines her two enemies, which are, she calls them the mystics of the mind and the mystics of muscle. The mystics of mind are the sort of what she calls like the witch doctors and the charlatans, the shamans. She would throw religion into that camp, but what she would also say is like she would also put like postmodernism in that camp, and behavioralism in that camp, and other things like that. And then she has the mystics of muscle, which is government. And so she talks about the idea of the main distinction between Rand and other modern philosophers is that Rand believed in the classical liberal notion that government's main function is to protect rights. And what the modern notion is government doesn't just protect rights, it also provides rights. So in political philosophy, we talk about negative rights and positive rights. Negative rights are like freedom, basically freedoms that you're allowed to do that the government cannot take away from you. So it's freedom of worship, freedom of speech, things like that. And then you have positive liberties, which are ones that are just bestowed upon you by government. So Franklin Roosevelt said those well in his Four Freedom speech. So he talks about freedom from want and freedom from fear. Freedom from want is a positive right in the sense that the government's going to mandate or guarantee you an income or guarantee you a job or guarantee you food or clothing or whatever. And Rand makes the argument that those rights, the positive rights, are antithetical to a free society. That once you have created a society by which those people live off of the achievements of others, is a society that begins to rot from within. And when you start, and it's her ultimate enemy is not benevolence, it's altruism. Altruism as defined as literally being selfless, without a self.
Yeah.
Abandoning your sense of self.
Where the only ethical action is the one that involves self-sacrifice.
Yes. And to her, sacrifice is like the ultimate sin.
Yeah.
And
because it is careless with life.
Yes. Exactly. And it's fundamentally anti-rational. It's and her fundamental person that she hates more than anybody else is Kant. The philosopher that she can't stand more than anything else is Kant. And it's because of Kant, she argues that mysticism got a modern patina on it. And so she argues about, and in this regard, I think in some respects, her thoughts on psychology are not always accurate because she was working in the confines of her time. She was also influenced by someone she used to work with, and that's a whole other story. There's a guy named Nathaniel Brandon. They ended up having sort of a years-long affair that like her wife knew, her husband knew about. It's weird. If anybody who's interested in learning about how weird her life was, I highly recommend reading Goddess of the Market by Jennifer Burns. It's a great intellectual history of Ayn Rand. And I hope the other thing you picked up with reading about her was the Nietzsche influence.
Yeah.
Which is there in a big way.
Even though she criticizes him,
yeah.
Oddly enough. It's so weird. She picked up his insights, but she doesn't think she got it from him.
Yeah.
Is what it seems like.
She thinks she gets everything from like Aristotle. It's like, no, you got that from Locke, you got that from Nietzsche, you got like it's very strange in some respects.
It's a difference like we were talking about earlier between what people actually believe and what they articulate.
True. And part of that was that she was not a professional academic philosopher. Yeah. She was a public intellectual.
Yeah.
And so her distinctions were different.
Yeah, her sins are absolvable in that sense.
Yeah, I think so. And I can't think of too many people who are philosophers like her who've sold millions of books.
Yeah.
I mean, and had, I think, a fundamental influence on the last half century of the United States. Mm. You cannot write the history of modern America without talking about Ayn Rand. It's kind of like trying to write the modern history of America without talking about Ronald Reagan. It's like you just can't do it. Or William F. Buckley. But that was always the thing I liked about her, was it was this radical philosophy, but that was rooted in sort of achievement and progress and industrialism and capitalism. It was one of the first books I'd ever read that defended capitalism.
Yeah, me too.
Which is defended them, and she didn't just make like the sort of pragmatic case for capitalism or the sort of utilitarian argument for capitalism. A lot of people, she makes the moral argument for capitalism.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. Yeah, she's virtually a singularity, at least among the people I've read.
Yeah, she's phenomenal, and in many ways, she's very much a classical philosopher in that she's building an entire system.
Yeah,
it's which is why, in some respects, her followers have sort of developed a cult-like status around her. It is sort of pseudo-cultish. I don't identify as an objectivist. There's a lot of things that I disagree with for purely pragmatic reasons. It's not like. But instinctually I'm a libertarian, and instinctually I'm an objectivist. It's an influence that has never been able to be. Mm-hmm. I can't unthink it. I can't remove it. I think the only person who's really made me sort of reconsider it or whatever is Dewey, who I really love too. And two people who couldn't be more different, but kind of come to some same conclusions. Anyway, we've spent a tremendous amount of time about talking about Ayn Rand. We don't have to anymore. But yeah, so
The one thing that sets the functions of church apart from the CFI meeting,
Yeah.
Wittgenstein had this saying that philosophy consists in a series of reminders, whereas some would think it's about the construction of a systematic understanding of reality or the self or something. I think the function of church is sort of similar. The sermons, the worship, the hymnals, for instance, when they were originally written, were written to teach the common person theology. It wasn't like you go into a church today, it's sort of a rock band, and you couldn't tell the difference between a song about your girlfriend and a song about God.
I always used to make a joke. I used to call it, you're trying to hip up Jesus.
Yeah. It's very, I think, sacrilegious in a lot of ways.
It's disgusting, yeah.
Counterproductive even. But the CFI, I think, it doesn't have reminders or overall concepts like sin and God that would develop a moral character.
True. And part of that is, I think, the nature of secularism itself. Secularism is not... It has a tradition, but not a system.
Yeah.
And so one of the... It sort of prides itself on not having one. And I think in some respects, I kind of like that. But in other ways, it is troubling, because then it's harder to sort of build, those binding agents of social sort of flourishing. But no, I can understand going there and feeling like you kind of went there for one thing and it was not really the thing you thought. I think probably closer to what you're talking about, or what you would like to see, is what happens at UU churches. Have you ever been to a UU church?
No.
Yeah, so you need to go to one, because I think you'll love it. It's exactly what you've just talked about. So generally what UU churches do is they're very liberal. They're Unitarian Universalists, for those out there. I've spoken it too. The thing that's really cool about UU churches is they do songs, they do hymns, they do rituals, they do a beginning of the flame and an ending of the flame. It's one of the big things they do. A sermon or a lecture, and a sort of a fellowship and socializing period at the end. UU churches are very close to what you've talked about. The idea that it's a way of being able to sort of get all of the things you've talked about with religion without, I think, some of the more explicitly outlined beliefs or practices. It's extremely ecumenical. I mean, you can be of any faith tradition or not at all and go to UU church. In fact, there are many people I've talked to who are like, I'm an atheist, or I'm an agnostic, or whatever, or I'm a deist or something, and they're like, but I come here because it gives me what I used to get out of religion that I still want, but I didn't want all the other stuff.
Yeah.
So UU churches are closer to, I think, what I think you might like. So I recommend going to one, and let me know if I'm on the mark there, because I think in terms of what you described earlier, it's pretty close.
Yeah.
But no, the coffee conversation is not... It's really not for that crowd in some respects. In some respects, it's kind of for the true believer. It's kind of for the person who's let religion go completely. They have no interest in it. They're really interested in something else. Or maybe they just didn't care.
Right. I'm not I wasn't advocating for a more religious service or anything like that.
No, I know that. But what I was saying is like a more of a, I guess, a format or a structure or a certain hallmarks that you think are important when you were talking about the sort of the reinforcements of main concepts and things like that.
Okay, yeah.
Because I do think that's something that lacks within secularism, and in that void is where you have problems.
Yeah.
That's really where you have problems. And again, when you don't have a sense of individualism and you have that void, that's when crazy shit happens in the form of identity politics and the sort of outrage as moral capital. But yeah, that's something that I think is a huge problem with, I think, our modern discourse is the fact that we've moved the discussion away from sort of like concepts of rights, concepts of policies, and talking about like things that actually work. And we're getting into this idea that the experience as data, rather than sort of, one thing that's really popular now within sort of the social sciences and academia. I don't know how much you're on Twitter. There's a really, really great Twitter page that I follow. I think it's called like Bad Peer Review or something like that, where they pull the most insane bullshit out of academia. It's remarkable. Okay. So, have you heard about the conceptual penis hoax?
No.
Okay, so you might appreciate it. So James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian, I mentioned Pete earlier, two guys. They basically pull. You know who Alan Sokal is? Alan Sokal is a social scientist who published basically a fake article in the 90s and got it through the system.
Yep.
And got it through and then delivered and said this was hoax. What Boghossian and Lindsay did was a modern Sokal hoax, where they wrote this article called The Conceptual Penis, and they argued that the conceptual penis caused climate change, which sounds fucking absurd. And they said that they deliberately wrote the piece to be opaque enough or obtuse enough that it would not have an exclusive point.
Yeah.
And it got accepted. Now people said, "Oh, what got accepted to a shitty journal?" Actually, it got accepted by a fairly acceptable journal that is routinely cited by other social science scholars. This is not a huge problem in like the hard sciences, but this is a huge problem in the soft sciences.
Yeah.
Where it's the postmodern bullshit. But they wrote a piece basically saying that the penis is a concept, and that the concept of the penis, basically like male chauvinism, phallocentrism is called climate change. Mm-hmm. And it blew up, and it was a whole thing or whatever. Well, that's what happens. But anyway, I forget. I'm so sorry. I forgot what I was going to say with this. But my main point was just like, there's crazy shit that happens in the social sciences that would not hold any water in like hard sciences or like business or anything like that. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge problem. That's something that we have not been able to combat. And I think part of the reason why it's so popular is because of the waning influence of religion in public life.
And the rising influence of Marxism. For instance, mm-hmm. He says philosophy has interpreted the world, but the point is to change it.
Exactly.
And I think the social sciences has taken that in stride.
Oh, absolutely.
It goes back to what you said earlier. Control the narrative. Yep. And you have the power.
Exactly. And part of this becomes, you have identity politics. And another version of this is intersectionalism or intersectionality, which is another component to this, where everything has to be seen through a lens of like whatever gender or race identity you identify as. What I meant to say earlier when I brought up like sort of the crazy shit in academia is one of the big things that's in social science now that I didn't even realize was possible is something called the self-ethnography. It is a very nice name. It's very fancy in academia. It basically means like, this is my experience. I have not researched this in relation to like actual data or like social science data. This is just my experience, and I'm going to write about it. Yeah. And I'm going to make that an academic peer-reviewed article. I'm going to call it a self-ethnography, and it's going to pass through. So now we're at a place where social science research, quote unquote, can be just whatever anybody fucking feels like. Mm-hmm. That's a huge problem. And the thing that I worry about is in the coming decades that this sort of bullshit will start to seep into the hard sciences. That's where I'm really fucking worried.
Yeah, I don't know if it could, because it seems like the difference between the social sciences and the hard sciences, for instance, mm-hmm. is the social sciences deal with its object of study is one that isn't merely an object, but something that uses concepts, and so it's half interpretive work and half data based, whereas I think the hard sciences, even though the frameworks are interpretations, the frameworks change depending on the data. Yes. Whereas the social sciences, the data can be whatever
True.
want.
I mean, I think you're right. So, for example, I'm a historian. I work in the soft sciences. I've written a master's thesis. And one thing that I tried desperately to do when I was working on my piece was to, I had a point of view, I had an argument, and I had interpretation, but I always tried my damnedest to back it up with evidence. I tried my best to say, based on my research, based on these sources, this is the conclusion I've made. And the beauty of that process was having an advisory committee, having a group of gentlemen who went through my work and critiqued it, and gave me feedback. And I acknowledge on some level that what I do is, in some respects, subjective. The historian is much like a detective. He or she goes in, sees the facts that are sort of there, and then deduces a conclusion based on what's there. That's what we do. I will never, ever claim that what I've argued about within my historical work is objective truth with a capital T. But what it is it's reasonable conclusions based on evidence. And in that regard, that's where the social sciences are going away. There's nothing wrong with interpretation. Interpretation is essential. Analysis is essential. Problem is, it needs to be rooted in evidence. It needs to be rooted in actual data that we can look at. So when people go out there and say, like, and I know this is gonna be hot water, I don't care. When people say something like, this country is just as racist as it was 50, 60 years ago. That might be the case. But we have to look at some of the objective facts, which is that, that race in this country has sadly still been a problem. Obviously, the horrible things that happened last week in Charlottesville. And I don't want to discount that. But there have been meaningful strides over the last few decades in sort of achieving some level of equality. It's not perfect, but it's there. The problem I have sometimes with some social science research is it just says, fuck all that because my experience is this. But you're one data set. And you're not bouncing your one data set off other stuff. You're just the one. And the equivalence of the one with all this other stuff is the problem that I have with some of the modern social research. It's like, there's nothing wrong with having an opinion about something or having a personal experience or an anecdote that then informs our decision. But the problem is when you equate that one position with mountains of empirical evidence about crime or drugs or violence or something like that, that's a huge problem, because when you equate the two, we can't actually have a reasonable conversation.
Right. Yeah, the move in the Intro to Philosophy course, which I thought was fundamental to critical thinking, was my professor always said, you have to be personal because you're given a perspective. But then you have to be critical about it.
Yes.
So that you experience that, but is it true that it's X, Y, or Z? Should I think about it in that way? Is that the best way to think about it? Or was I overcome by X, Y, or Z? Right? Things like that.
I think you're right. There was a great quote actually by Penn Jillette, I was just looking up the other day, who said, the things that you wish to believe in the most are the things you should probably question the most, or something like that. And I think that's true. I think we should question others' beliefs, but we should be just as hard on our own.
Right.
And one of the beauties of our friendship and the beauties of our conversation is you've really helped me really criticize and challenge some of my basic assumptions about my positions on things. And I appreciate that tremendously, because so much of what I hear from other people is very much like, they're kind of like ditto heads, and that's fine. It's not a problem to like get around with each other and have sort of a circle jerk. Like, I don't care, that's fine. But that kind of has its place. But it's not very challenging.
Yeah.
Whereas when I have conversations with you, or that conversation with that apologist, which didn't go great, but I thought was very rewarding, because I left that conversation going like, I should have said this, I should have said that, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah.
There was a certain level of anguish that I had that I imagine he probably didn't even remotely have on the other end. But there was this, I went in a funk for like 2 or 3 days, like challenging every base assumption in my head, because that's what I do. I can't help it. That's the nature of being a skeptic. And I appreciate the fact that you come at religion like an anthropologist would, in some respects. I think that's where you're very similar to James, and that you, I think, respect and understand the sociological aspects of religion that a lot of people don't. And that's where we atheists get into trouble. I really do. I think that's where we get into trouble. Is nothing wrong with like criticizing the beliefs, but you need to understand that like religion is so much more than that.
Even more so, I think it's important, like in James's work, The Varieties of Religious Experience. I think for someone to say they understand a religious belief, they would have to be able to reasonably infer what somebody infers when they say that they believe something. So that I would be able to represent to you a statement somebody would say if they were religious and they encountered a certain situation. Right.
Yeah.
So that there's predictability.
Yeah. No, I totally get that.
So there's a way to falsify my own beliefs about what religious believers believe.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I do too is alongside that, that divide, there's this, I think, reaffirmation of the capacity for one to constantly challenge yourself. Because I think that's one of the things that's rewarding for my life. It's one of the beauties of, in my opinion, of being secular. One of the rewarding factors is the ability to constantly reevaluate and challenge your beliefs. And I think, and I'm not saying that's exclusive to secularism.
Yeah.
But I do think it's something that comes as a part of the package. Sometimes. I would say not all of the time.
Yeah, because we all have feelings.
We all have feelings, and we all have like base assumptions
Yeah.
and all kinds of things like that we will just sort of go with. But
even on the other side of assumptions, unarticulated drives, right?
Mm-hmm.
That make us desire things that we don't even know we desire.
Yeah.
In terms of pursuing this line of reasoning over that one. There's no reason. Something just makes me go that direction, right?
True.
Kind of strange.
True. And it's the thing is it's
the unconscious.
There's two ways to frame the question, where it's like the question of like, why am I an atheist? So there's two ways that why means something. There's the why I'm an atheist, which is like the evidence for why I don't believe in God or whatever. But there's also the why are you an atheist, which is like the what about you as a human being? What's a part of you, your makeup, your whatever, that makes you have sort of a predisposition to it? Because I do think on some level that I was sort of born with it. I can't explain that. I admit that what I could say right now is complete bullshit. All I'm saying is like to a certain level, like I was built and hardwired alongside sort of the social conditioning that I got.
Yeah.
That's, I think, incredibly important.
Right.
That just sort of primed me to be a skeptic. I was never, like I said to you before, I was never in a church. I never went to religious services. Religion didn't mean all that much to me. Mm-hmm. I didn't really learn much about Christianity until I was in high school. It was always something that was sort of this other thing that people did, but I didn't. And that was okay. Yeah. And so it's always been intellectual to me. And the thing that I think I've realized now is that yes, it's still intellectual to me, but the other thing is important is to acknowledge the sort of the numinous and the experiential and the communal and those things too, because that's a part of human nature. And I think we often try to over-rationalize ourselves instead of sort of accepting where we can be reasonable and then just sort of acknowledging when we're not reasonable.
Yeah.
Is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to?
Not that I can think of in the moment.
Okay.
But just one more point.
Sure.
I guess with that intuition versus rational stuff and trying to understand religious beliefs. I know I brought this example up to you before, but I still think about it all the time. Over Christmas, my wife and I went skiing for the first time in Colorado. It was my first time skiing. She had skied before. But after a few runs, she said to me at the bottom of the slope that she was going to crash, but she had all of a sudden she had this calmness to her, and objectively she was saying to herself, just calm down, just do X, Y, and Z, swerve this way. You're fine. You're not going to wreck. So she said that to me at the bottom of the slope. I was like, all right, yeah, I can see that. There's been situations where I've done that to myself to keep calm and to go through a situation without any harm. And then we went to this, at the church I attended in high school, we went to this gathering. It was Christmas Eve, and they sung hymns and stuff. And the pastor's wife told this story. She was on her way home from a different city, and it was like 1 a.m. She was really tired. And a semi was coming from the opposite direction, and she was really tired, so she sort of dozed off and veered towards the semi. And when she came to, the semi was right in front of her, and she was going to hit it. And she said she heard God tell her, "Don't touch the steering wheel." And so she didn't, and she just sort of skidded along the side of it, and she was fine. She didn't wreck.
Wow.
And she says, if I would have swerved, who knows what would have happened? Maybe I would have crashed right into it. Maybe I would have went off the road and flipped. Maybe I wouldn't be here,
Mm-hmm.
But what strikes me in those instances is the different traditions they sort of have now, different languages that they use. Because I can imagine my wife being in her position and relaying the story to me in the way she did at the bottom of the slope, saying, all of a sudden I had this calmness and I was being rational, right? But the pastor's wife says God tells her not to swerve. And I don't know what the difference is there, except in, obviously there's difference in language and belief. But I think there's a way in which that experience the pastor's wife has memorializes her memory, whereas my wife probably can't recall that skiing, her relaying that information to me.
Oh yeah.
So because she connects it with this concept of God, it's like it sort of unifies her past in the sense that life is good somehow despite.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It actually reminds me of another thing about Kahneman. Kahneman is the idea of the experiencing self and the remembering self. That the experiencing self is the part of you that is the way the brain works in the experiencing notion, where it's very much kind of like the experiencing self is like a live stream where it's just sort of happening and you're rolling with it and you're kind of doing as best you can.
Yeah.
The remembering self is after the stream is ended and you can go back and you can like cut out the shit that was dumb or cut out the things you think were important, and then you can add a thumbnail to it and a title and like this thing. And the brain works the same way, in the sense that so much of what we experience every single day the brain forgets, because the brain can only comprehend so much at any given time. What we then remember is it's not so much like, and this is a mistake a lot of people make, where memories are not like a videotape. Memories are like a story. It's a reconstruction of a memory. And like I have a very vivid memory when I was a very small boy and I was sledding with my family. And even though I'm a fairly large guy now, I was a very little kid, and I slid under my parents' car. And it was weird because like there were a whole bunch of cars lined up, but the car I ended up going under was my parents' car. It was a very weird coincidental moment. Now, I will tell you this. I don't remember being on the hill. I don't remember being in the car. I don't remember going down the hill. I don't remember going under the car. The only thing I remember about that experience, I was probably maybe 4 or 5 years old, was being pulled out from underneath the car by my mother. And hearing this woman who I did not know and can't remember her face, don't even know what she sounds like, hearing her go like, thank the Lord the kid's okay. Thank Jesus. I'm so glad the Lord saved him today. This and that, or some shit like that. And it always made me wonder, I'm like, that lady was so weird to me for some reason as a little kid, because again, I didn't grow up with religion, so I didn't know what the hell she was talking about, but it's such a vivid memory in my head. And I don't know if that's because of sort of the cultural milieu of religion. I think it is. And what's funny is I had a very similar experience about 20 years later when I got another car, and I had the car for like 2 or 3 days, and I was driving down a snowy kind of icy road, and I hit the brakes too hard and I spun all the way around. And there's this huge ass mailbox that's on the left side of the road that's like bricks. It's like a big brick mailbox that would have probably like destroyed my car or killed me. And I decided, instead of just turning with the skid or like hitting the brakes even harder, I just let go of everything and sort of just like keep the wheel straight, and I just kind of spin until I'm done, and I'm done and at the end. Now, I'm a dyed-in-the-fucking-wool atheist. I'm a materialist, I'm a naturalist, I'm an empiricist, but I will tell you what, when that happened and I spun all the way around, I went, thank God.
Yeah.
Thank Jesus. And it was not, and even after it was all done, it wasn't like I was literally, it was just like an exclamation of just like you said earlier, life is good.
Yeah.
Man, I was really, like, me saying like, thank God, I thank Jesus. I wasn't literally thanking God or thanking Jesus.
Yeah.
I'm culturally primed to say things like that, even though I'm an atheist and didn't grow up with a religion, but grew up in a culture that we're like, oh, thank Jesus, thank Christ, or whatever. But that's my way of saying like, wow, I'm really lucky. Wow, I'm really lucky.
Right.
So I totally understand that story because I've had 2 very similar ones in my life. And what's weird is that like later on I would go like, I'm rationalizing this or whatever, but it was in the moment. You act as your true self, I guess. And even though, like I said, even though I'm an atheist and I've never really been a Christian, it was just one of those things like, thank God, thank Jesus. Even though I wasn't really thanking Jesus, I was just kind of thanking nothing, but sort of thanking the universe. I don't know. But that's what we do as pattern seeking, agent making, meaning making beings. That was what we do. So I appreciate that story. But Tylor, this has been a blast, man.
Yeah.
I hope I haven't talked too much in the conversation.
No.
I hope I've given you enough time to speak your views. You're welcome back anytime, of course. I'd love to have you back when we do our next set of essays or whatever. Cool. This is the part of the show where you get to plug whatever you want. So, plug away. I'm all about opportunity. So,
check out Christianity-now.com. Our homepage and articles are dedicated to sort of liberal, non-supernaturalistic articulation of the Christian message. But the new section that Justin and I have established, called Secularism, or a dialogue on religion and secularism, is specifically to sort of demythologize religion, strip it down, talk about its functions, and what kind of import it could have for secularism or a world without religion. What kinds of things secularism has sort of neglected to develop and needs to develop in order to be a truly humanistic endeavor. So check out that. Like us on Facebook if you want.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to put the links for things in the show notes. And check out Tylor's excellent piece on our first dialogues. Check out my piece. I forget exactly the exact title of yours, but it's like Identity Politics has Replaced Religion or something like that. I'm sorry.
How identity politics indicates the decline of religion.
Right on. Mine's just called After the Exit. It's just reflections on leaving religion, and we're going to have a next round of essays soon, and it's been a really rewarding experience. It's really, what's fun is it's really kind of taken me out of my comfort zone and really had me think about things and really challenge assumptions, which I think we should all do as critical thinkers. So, Tylor, thank you very much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I really appreciate it. So that's it for Reason Revolution. You can follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/Reason Revolution. I want to get the likes up. We got about 60 people. It's very small, but we're a very dedicated group of people. I'd like to see it get to 100 by the end of the month. We'll see how it goes. I do want to thank a person specifically. I hope he doesn't mind that I mention his name. Alex Geldo, who is a person who follows me on Instagram and Twitter, is always liking and sharing my stuff. Thank you so much for doing that. It means the world to me. I really appreciate it. You're a great follower and a great person, so thanks a lot for doing that. It means a lot. You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at The Daily Clark. And until next week, this has been Justin Clark, and this has been Reason Revolution.